Hi everybody, it's Whitney from All the Shelves. Today I'm going to be talking about the 3 books that I read in the first half of July. There's only 3 of them, but in the second half I've started to pick things up, and so I don't want to get overwhelmed at the end of the month. Plus, you know me, I can go on and on about books, so hopefully I can keep this video a little bit shorter than usual. The first book I read in July was A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki, and I know that this book is really beloved on BookTube. There are a lot of booktubers who talk about Ruth Ozeki. This is the first that I've read of hers, but they specifically really love this book. And it was a 2013 Man Booker Prize finalist, and it has like really great reviews on the back. So I chose this one for my best friend book club that I have. It's just a 2-person book club, but we read a book together and then we have like themed meals about that book because we are super cute. So I liked this book, and there were parts of it that I absolutely loved about this book. The depiction of bullying in this is so visceral and so disturbing that I have thought about it probably every day since I've read this book. Little bits and pieces of this book will like pop back up for me. And I think the way that she explores a teenager experiencing bullying is really astute. And so I liked that part, and I also really loved the teenager's relationship with her monk grandmother, who would give her some kind of like old person life advice like we're used to, but she would do it with a kind of edge and a kind of realism that I really appreciated. So I loved that aspect of it. What I didn't love about it was the shift between narrative voices. So you had a woman who was living in the Pacific Northwest on like a island with her husband in this kind of like secluded area, and one day on the beach this Hello Kitty box shows up and it has a diary and some other materials in it, and her and her husband are wondering if this could be wash up from the Japanese tsunami. So they start going through it and she starts like slowly reading it, and for some reason she has like a lot of trepidation about just reading it through. Like she wants to relive the life of the girl who's writing the diary. And while I appreciated how that tied into her writing life, the kind of like leaps that it takes at the end bother me. And I won't spoil anything, but I will say that there's a kind of pretentiousness to the end of this that was kind of annoying. I mean, it required the use of multiple appendices, if that gives you some idea of how like pretentious it gets. And there was like a kind of postmodern edge to it that I thought was a little, I want to say unnecessary. I didn't really quite get the point. Like the woman who lives in the Pacific Northwest is also named Ruth, and she's also a writer, and it kind of seems like she is the writer. So if anyone has some thoughts on why she did that, why she inserted herself, made it a fictional self, but like just barely into a novel about a teenage girl. The other thing that was a little bit strange was the shift in voice. It never allowed me to get totally used to the teenage style of speaking, and I have a hard time listening to teenagers talk for a long time. I have a lot of younger brothers and sisters, and I've taught teenagers, and so maybe I'm just like fed up with them, and when I escape to a narrative world I don't want to hear a teenager talk. So something in a teenage voice can get on my nerves, and I think that I would have gotten used to it had there not been like breakaways to the author's perspective. So those were my thoughts on A Tale for the Time Being. Let me know what you really loved about this book, because I'm going to be eating sushi and talking with my BFF about it, and I can share your insights with her. The next book I read was Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. My AP class that I'm stepping into in the fall had a summer reading assignment, and they could choose from a number of writers' memoirs or writing advice type books. And this was one of the books that they were given to choose from, so I thought I better read it because I suspect that a few of my students will be sort of attracted to this kind of a writing advice book. I like the way that this is divided up. She basically is giving advice as though she is having a very personal seminar, so as though she has just a few students and that they're sharing their lives with each other and their habits, in addition to writing techniques and tips of the trade and that kind of stuff. And while I did enjoy this book and I found a lot of inspiration in it, especially for somebody who wants to write, or somebody, I'm writing a dissertation right now, and so any kind of like nugget of inspiration I can get to keep going, on that really stressful, really tedious journey is very helpful for me. But there were like also some spiritual things tucked into the book that I just didn't find particularly relevant. A lot about, you know, attending to nature and God and this kind of stuff that I guess feels a little like artsy fartsy hippy dippy to me. I'm told by those same teenagers I mentioned before that nobody says hippy dippy anymore, but whatever, like my grandma says it, I say it. I think it's a useful term, especially for describing somebody like Anne Lamott, who is bringing a lot of spiritualism into our work. So it wasn't totally for me. I think I liked On Writing by Stephen King a lot more, but I could see how it would be really appealing to a lot of people. And the third book that I read this month was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. I read this at a very young age. Too early to really understand it. So my story with Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn is that when I was a kid, I loved The Adventures of Tom Sawyer so much that when I was reading it for the third time, I think maybe in a row, like it was in a very condensed time period, I hid behind the couch when I was reading it because I thought my mom would be mad at me for rereading a book I had already read so many times, I guess. She obviously was not mad at me. She encouraged my reading, but it was like this not shameful secret, but it was a little secretive that I loved it so much that I wasn't willing to even read any other books. So then I read Huckleberry Finn, and the language is obviously way harder. It's written in the first person instead of the third person, and that's kind of like the main thing about it, right, is that he captured this southern idiom. And he writes the book in dialect, which is very difficult for a kid to read. I think I was in like the third grade when I read this. So I made it all the way through, and there were moments that were really memorable to me. And I remember loving the Elijah Wood movie. Did you guys watch that? It was so good to me. I loved Elijah Wood as a kid. But I can't say that any kid who would read Huckleberry Finn, no matter how brilliant, which I'm not saying I was, could really understand what's going on here. Even as an adult, there were moments where I was trying to figure this book out. And I read recently a book that I'll talk about in my next wrap-up called The Machine in the Garden by Leo Marks, and he has a brilliant reading of Huckleberry Finn that I will kind of be drawing on. But he talks about how Twain started the novel as a kind of like fun pastoral romp where Huckleberry Finn feels confined by the like strictures of Southern culture, and so he escapes to an island. He finds Jim, the runaway slave, and they get on a raft and travel down the Mississippi. But the story is that as Mark Twain started writing this thing, he gets to a moment where he realized that he's become so wrapped up in the freed slave narrative that he can no longer in good conscience make this just a comic, picaresque pastoral, like you know, adventure to adventure going down the river. At some point you need to deal with the fact that Huckleberry Finn is traveling with an escaped slave, right? And so then the book sort of goes into a more piercing satire of American values and what America thinks of itself, and especially like American individualism and morality. And so the second half of the book doesn't quite seem to match up with the first half, but it's that disruption between the two halves that is so interesting, and I think what makes us keep returning to this novel over and over again. It's the fact that what starts as an Edenic kind of journey becomes something critical and actually quite scary. And so I think it's pretty obvious that I was just blown away by reading this as an adult. It's obviously been like a huge gap in my American lit knowledge, so I needed to read it. I needed to read it 10 years ago again, but I'm so glad that I read it this month. This is one that I'll be returning to again and again. I think that it is full of really beautiful moments, and it's full of really insightful character traits and perceptions of how humans kind of connect to each other. And it is also like there are moments that are just really mean-spirited and hilarious, the way that Mark Twain can be. So yeah, if you haven't read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, I think this is a book for everybody. So those are the three books that I read in the first half of July. Let me know if you've read any of these. These are some very popular books, so I imagine that we will have a lot to talk about, and I'll see you later.